The sun hung low in the blue sky, casting a warm golden glow across the lush green fields. It was Sunday, a day Alice treasured because it gave her a break from her usual chores. Although her mother, Camilla, was gentle and rarely overloaded Alice with work, Sundays still felt like a small escape. This morning, Alice had dutifully washed the family's utensils and ensured the goats and pigs were secure in their pens. Now, her free hours were spent in the nearby farms with a handful of local children. The laughter of children echoed through the air as they played a lively game of tag. Alice, despite being older, joined in their fun with a lightness that made her seem like one of them. She was running with bare feet through the cool grass, her auburn hair falling loose over her shoulders, when a shadow appeared from the edge of the field. Alice stopped abruptly, her laughter catching in her throat. Standing a few feet away was a man she had never seen before. He was tall and strikingly handsome, with sharp features and an easy confidence that made him look like he belonged anywhere he stepped foot. He smiled warmly, his dark eyes glinting with intelligence. "Hello," the man said, his voice smooth and friendly. "I was walking by and saw you all having so much fun. Mind if I join in?" The children paused, their eyes wide with curiosity. But Alice felt her heart skip a beat, unease creeping into her chest. She wasn't used to strangers, and this man's sudden appearance set her on edge. I don't know," Alice replied hesitantly, glancing at the children for reassurance. The man seemed to notice her discomfort. He tilted his head slightly and smiled again, this time softer and less imposing. "I should introduce myself," he said, taking a small step closer. "My name is Logan. I live in the village nearby. I promise I'm not here to cause any trouble. Just thought I'd relive my childhood for a moment." Alice still felt wary, but Logan's tone was disarming, and there was something genuine about the way he spoke. "I'm Alice," she finally said, her voice quieter than usual. Logan nodded and then turned to the children, quickly engaging them in their game. He had a clever way with words, weaving jokes and light-hearted remarks that soon had everyone, even Alice, laughing. Slowly but surely, her discomfort began to melt away, replaced by a cautious curiosity. They played together for a while, Logan proving to be an agile and quick participant. The children adored him, chasing him through the fields and squealing with delight as he let them catch him once or twice. Alice observed him quietly, intrigued by how easily he fit into their little group. After some time, Logan dusted off his hands and straightened up. "Well, I think I've had enough fun for now," he said with a grin. "But I've got work to do." The children groaned in protest, and even Alice felt a pang of disappointment. She had begun to enjoy his company, though she still couldn't quite place why he had shown up out of nowhere. "Maybe I'll see you all again sometime," Logan added, giving a small wave before walking off toward the distant road. Alice watched him go, her mind swirling with unanswered questions. She didn't know what it was about him, his charm, his cleverness, or perhaps something else entirely, but she felt certain this wouldn't be the last she saw of Logan. The children began to disperse as the sun began its slow descent. Alice lingered for a moment before heading home, the farm being just a short walk away. She strolled leisurely, her thoughts still on the stranger who had joined them that day. As she approached the edge of the field, a faint sound of hooves reached her ears. She looked up and froze. In the distance, a young man sat astride a magnificent black horse. His presence was striking. He wore a deep blue tunic embroidered with gold, his dark hair falling elegantly over his forehead. His posture was regal, and even from afar, Alice could see the unmistakable aura of someone important. Her breath caught in her throat as she watched him ride by. Who was he? What was someone like him doing so close to her humble village? She had seen royal processions before, but had never been this close to a figure of such status. For a moment, she imagined what it might be like to live such a life, to wear such fine clothes and ride freely across the countryside on a horse as majestic as his. The young man glanced briefly in her direction, and Alice quickly looked away, her cheeks flushing with embarrassment. By the time she looked back, he was gone, a fleeting figure disappearing over the horizon. Shaking herself from her thoughts, Alice continued her walk home. She pushed open the wooden gate and stepped inside her modest house, her mind still buzzing with the events of the day. First Logan, now this mysterious rider. It felt as though the quiet life she had always known was on the verge of changing, though she couldn't quite explain why. Little did she know, this was only the beginning. The next morning, the sun rose lazily over the countryside, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. Alice led her family's goats to graze in her father's farm, the lush fields dewy and quiet, save for the soft bleating of the animals. The solitude was something Alice cherished. It was her time to think and let her mind wander. But today, her peaceful routine was interrupted by a familiar figure standing at the edge of the field. "Good morning, Alice," Logan called, his voice warm and cheerful. He leaned casually against the wooden fence, his dark eyes gleaming with energy. Alice stopped, blinking in surprise. She hadn't expected to see him again so soon. "Logan? What are you doing here?" Logan hopped over the fence effortlessly and walked toward her, his confident stride making it clear he felt at ease in her presence. "I was just passing by," he said with a grin. "But it seems I've caught you at work. Where are the kids today?" Alice shrugged, her hands gripping the rope she used to guide the goats. "They're at school, I suppose. And I'm busy today, so I can't play." Logan raised his hands in mock surrender. "Relax. I'm not here to play. I'm actually considering starting a goat farm myself, so I thought I'd walk through the fields and get a sense of it." Alice tilted her head, curiosity sparking in her hazel eyes. "A goat farm? You?" "Why not?" Logan said, his tone light but his expression serious. "It's honest work, and it seems fulfilling." Alice nodded slowly, her initial wariness fading. She still didn't know much about him, but his words sounded genuine. "Well, you've come to the right place. My father's been farming goats for years." "Exactly," Logan said smoothly. "So tell me, what's the secret to running a successful farm?" They began walking together, Alice leading her goats while Logan strolled beside her, asking questions about everything from feeding schedules to pasture maintenance. At first, Alice was hesitant, but as the conversation continued, she found herself enjoying his company. Logan had a way of making her feel heard, as if every word she said was valuable. Unbeknownst to Alice, Logan wasn't there for farming advice. He was captivated by her quiet intelligence, her unassuming charm, and the way her eyes lit up when she spoke about her life. But Alice remained oblivious, assuming his interest was purely professional. When the sun began to climb higher in the sky, Alice stopped. "I should get back. The goats have had their fill for the morning." Logan hesitated, then said, "Would you mind if we talked again tomorrow? I'd love to hear more about your farm and your life." Alice blinked at the request, but after a moment she nodded. "Sure, if I'm around." The next day, Logan was waiting for her again. This time, their conversation veered away from farming. Logan asked about her family, her hobbies, and even her favorite places in the village. Alice noticed the shift but didn't mind it. She found Logan's company comforting, a welcome break from her solitary routines. Unbeknownst to them, they weren't entirely alone. From a distance, Camilla, Alice's mother, watched the pair with a critical eye. She saw the way Logan's gaze lingered on Alice and how her daughter seemed to trust him already. When Alice returned home that evening, her mother was waiting. "Who was that man you were with?" Camilla asked, her tone even but her eyes sharp. Alice paused, then replied, "His name's Logan. He's new to the area. He's a friend." "A friend?" Camilla repeated, her skepticism evident. "He's kind," Alice said earnestly. "And he wants to start a farm, so I'm just helping him out." Camilla studied her daughter for a moment, her face unreadable. Finally, she said, "Be careful, Alice. Not everyone is as they seem." Alice nodded, but inside she felt a flicker of irritation. Logan had been nothing but kind and respectful. Why should she doubt him? As she lay in bed that night, Alice's mind drifted back to Logan's easy smile and the way he seemed genuinely interested in her. For the first time in a long while, she felt like she had made a real friend. But what Alice didn't realize was that her mother's instincts were rarely wrong. The morning sunlight filtered through the fields as Alice went about her chores, still contemplating the unexpected companionship she had found in Logan. She was brushing her goats when he arrived, his usual confident demeanor in place. "Alice," Logan said, his voice unusually gentle, "I was thinking, would you like to visit the city nearby, just for a coffee? You've been so helpful with farming advice, and I thought it might be nice to thank you properly." Alice froze for a moment. The idea was tempting. She had never seen the city before, never stepped into a coffee shop or walked its bustling streets, but her cautious nature took over. "I don't think I should. I've never been to the city, and it's far," she said, looking away. Logan gave her an encouraging smile. "That's exactly why you should go. You'll love it. Just one day. I'll bring you back safe, I promise." Her mind wavered, torn between her desire for adventure and her instinct to remain in her comfort zone. Finally, she agreed. "All right, just for a little while." The two set off, walking through the countryside toward the distant city. As they approached the outskirts, Alice noticed a sprawling estate in the distance. Its towering walls gleamed in the sunlight, and its ornate turrets pierced the sky. "What is that?" she asked, her voice filled with wonder. Logan glanced at the structure and smirked. "That's the castle of the Queen. The royal family lives there. They're unbelievably rich. Can you imagine what it must be like to live in a place like that?" Alice's gaze lingered on the castle, her imagination running wild. She had never seen anything so grand. What kind of life unfolded behind those walls? What kind of people lived there? The sight filled her with awe and curiosity. They continued their journey, and soon the city came into view. It was unlike anything Alice had ever seen. The streets were alive with colors and sounds, vendors calling out, carriages rattling by, and people bustling around in fine clothes. "This is beautiful," Alice said softly, her eyes lighting up as they walked. Logan smiled at her reaction. "I knew you'd like it." They found a quaint coffee shop tucked in a corner of the city. Alice stared at the intricately carved wooden sign above the entrance and the large windows displaying rows of cakes and pastries. Inside, the smell of freshly brewed coffee was rich and inviting. Over coffee and lunch, Logan tried to steer the conversation toward Alice, asking about her dreams and interests. Alice, still enchanted by the city, answered without much thought, feeling grateful for his company. On their way back, the cheerful mood shifted as they entered the deep forest a mile from Alice's home. The trees loomed high, their shadows long and dense. Logan, walking beside her, slowed his pace and glanced at her. "You know, Alice," he began, his voice low, "you're a very beautiful girl." Alice paused, taken aback. "Oh, thank you," she said awkwardly. The compliment flattered her, but something about the tone unsettled her. Before she could say more, Logan leaned closer. Without warning, he tried to kiss her. Alice pulled back sharply. "What are you doing?" she exclaimed. Logan looked apologetic, his confidence faltering. "I'm sorry," he said quickly. "I thought you liked me." Alice took a step back, her voice firm. "Maybe I do, but I don't know you. We've only met a few times." Logan sighed and looked away, as though gathering his thoughts. Then, without warning, he tried again, this time more insistent. Alice shoved him away and shouted, "Stop! What are you doing?" Logan's face reddened. "I'm sorry, Alice," he stammered. "I promise I won't do it again." Alice glared at him, anger and disappointment washing over her. "I never should have come alone with you," she said, her voice trembling with emotion. Before Logan could respond, the sound of hoofbeats echoed through the forest. Alice turned to see a young man riding toward them. He was dressed in fine attire, and the regal way he carried himself made it clear he was no ordinary traveler. The man stopped his horse and looked at Alice. "My lady," he said, his voice calm yet commanding. "Are you all right?" Alice glanced at Logan, then back at the rider. "Maybe I'm not," she admitted quietly. The man's expression hardened as he turned his gaze to Logan. "Is he bothering you?" Alice hesitated, then said, "Yes." The rider dismounted, his boots crunching against the forest floor. With a swift motion, he drew a gleaming sword from his side. Logan took a step back, his confidence replaced by fear. "Wait," Alice said, stepping forward. "Please don't harm him." The man hesitated, then lowered his sword. He looked at Alice with a gentler expression. "Would you like me to escort you home?" he asked. Alice nodded slowly. "Yes, please." She climbed onto his horse, leaving Logan behind. As the rider guided his horse out of the forest, Alice remained silent, her mind replaying the events that had just unfolded. When they arrived at her home, Alice stepped down from the horse and turned to the man. "Thank you," she said sincerely. He gave her a small bow. "It was my honor. I am Prince Charles of the royal castle." Alice's breath caught as she realized who he was. His charm and poise left her momentarily speechless. Inside, Camilla, her mother, met her with a concerned look. "Where were you all this time?" she asked. "I got lost in the forest," Alice said quickly. "This man helped me." Camilla's eyes shifted to Charles, her expression wary. "You shouldn't go into the forest anymore," she said firmly. Then, after a pause, she added, "And you should keep your distance from royal people." Alice lowered her gaze, her emotions a mixture of relief and disappointment. She had trusted Logan, only to feel betrayed. Yet, in her moment of need, it was the prince who had come to her rescue. As she lay in bed that night, her mind lingered on the day's events and the two men who had unexpectedly entered her life. The sun was bright, casting a golden hue across the fields as Alice grazed her goats. She was still unsettled by the memory of the previous day, but found comfort in the routine of farm work. As she bent to pick a stray weed, movement in the distance caught her attention. It was him, the prince. Prince Charles walked leisurely through the fields, pausing to admire the flowers. He plucked one from its stem and held it delicately, examining its vibrant petals. Alice approached quietly, her steps purposeful. "Flowers aren't meant to be separated from their plants," she said, her voice calm but firm. "They're most beautiful when they remain where they belong." Charles turned, startled at first, but then breaking into a warm smile. "You're absolutely right," he said, placing the flower back gently. "I apologize. I didn't mean to harm it." Alice shrugged, trying to mask her shyness. "What brings you here?" "I was passing through and thought I'd enjoy the countryside," Charles replied. His gaze swept across the farm. "Is this your land?" "It's my father's farm," Alice said. Charles nodded thoughtfully and then added, "I was actually looking for flowers for a little arrangement. Do you think you could help me?" Alice bent down and gathered a few blossoms that had already fallen to the ground. She held them out to him. "These will do. They're still lovely." Charles took them with a grateful smile. "Thank you. I owe you a treat for your kindness. Perhaps a dinner at the castle?" Alice's cheeks warmed. "Maybe another day," she replied, managing a small smile. "Well, in case I haven't mentioned it before, I'm Charles," he said, inclining his head slightly. "I know," Alice murmured, watching him walk away. As she returned home, her thoughts lingered on the prince's gesture and the elegance he carried. Despite her worries about Logan, she couldn't help but feel a small sense of pride that a royal had taken the time to speak with her. The next morning, Alice's father, James, announced his plans to sell their best vegetables and fruits to the royal family. Alice's ears perked up. "Would you like to come with me?" James asked casually. Alice hesitated. Her curiosity to see the castle up close was overwhelming, but she didn't want to appear too eager. "I have chores to do," she replied, feigning disinterest. Her mother, Camilla, who was sewing nearby, interjected, "Visiting the royal palace isn't for girls like us, Alice. Stay here and finish your work." James frowned, his tone firm. "Alice will come. It's good for her to see the world outside this farm." Alice glanced at her father, grateful but still hesitant. "All right, I'll go," she said quietly. The journey to the castle felt like stepping into another world. As they approached, the towering walls and majestic turrets came into view, their grandeur even more breathtaking up close. The gates loomed high, guarded by soldiers in polished armor. James approached one of the guards and announced, "I'm the farmer who delivers vegetables and fruits to the queen every week." The guard nodded and disappeared inside. Moments later, he returned and said, "Come in." Alice and her father stepped through the gates, and Alice was immediately overwhelmed by the beauty of the castle grounds. Gardens stretched endlessly, fountains sparkled in the sunlight, and the stone pathways were perfectly clean. Inside the main hall, the splendor was even more striking. Chandeliers of gold hung above, and tapestries adorned the walls, each telling a story of the royal family's legacy. Alice felt small but mesmerized by the environment. Soon, Queen Kinsley herself appeared. She was regal, her every movement exuding authority and grace. James immediately knelt, and Alice followed his lead. "Rise," the Queen said kindly. Her voice was warm but commanding. James opened his baskets, revealing the freshest vegetables and fruits. "Your Majesty," he said, "these are my finest produce." The Queen inspected the goods and asked, "What's the price for everything in the city?" $120, Your Majesty," James replied. The Queen smiled faintly and turned to one of her guards. "Pay him $200. His work deserves recognition." James stammered out a thank you, his gratitude evident. As the transaction concluded, the sound of footsteps echoed through the hall. Alice turned to see Charles approaching. He greeted her warmly, a genuine smile lighting his face. "Alice," he said, his tone friendly. "What a pleasant surprise." James glanced at his daughter, then at the prince, clearly taken aback. "You know my daughter, Your Highness." Charles's smile widened. "We've met in the countryside. She's been very kind." James quickly knelt again, and Alice followed, her face flushing. "There's no need for that," Charles said gently. "Please rise." Then, turning to his mother, he added, "May I invite them for coffee? It's the least we can do for such hard-working people." James hesitated. "Your Highness, we're not—" The Queen cut him off with a raised hand. "Are you denying the royals, farmer?" she asked, her tone light but teasing. "It's my order." James cleared his throat. "Of course, Your Majesty. It would be an honor." Alice and her father were led through the castle, every step revealing more of its splendor. They entered a dining hall, where an elaborate breakfast spread awaited them. Silver platters held pastries, fruits, and dishes Alice couldn't even name. Charles joined them at the table, sitting beside Alice. Despite his princely demeanor, he spoke casually, making them feel at ease. "Try this," Charles said, handing Alice a plate with tiny, intricately decorated cakes. Alice hesitated before taking a bite. The sweetness was unlike anything she had tasted before. Her father, too, seemed to enjoy the meal, though he remained cautious, aware of the company he was keeping. As they finished their coffee and breakfast, Charles turned to James. "Your produce is truly exceptional. The royal kitchens will make great use of it." James smiled humbly. "Thank you, Your Highness. It's an honor to serve the royal family." When it was time to leave, Charles walked them to the gate himself. Alice's mind swirled with a mixture of emotions: gratitude for the prince's kindness, awe at the castle's grandeur, and a lingering unease from her encounter with Logan. As they returned home, Alice couldn't help but feel that her life had been forever changed by the events of the past few days. The castle, the Queen, and Prince Charles had opened a door to a world she never imagined she could glimpse. Alice's father was preparing dinner when he turned to her, curiosity in his voice. "Alice, how do you know the prince?" Alice hesitated. The memory of her encounter in the forest resurfaced, still vivid and strange. "I was lost in the woods one evening," she explained. "He found me and helped me get home." James raised an eyebrow but didn't press further. He simply said, "That's quite the tale," before returning to his work. That night, sleep eluded Alice. The image of Prince Charles's warm smile and the grandeur of the castle lingered in her thoughts. She found herself replaying every moment of the day, her fascination with the prince and his world growing stronger. The following week, the sound of hooves startled Alice as she finished sweeping the yard. Looking up, she saw Prince Charles arriving on his horse, flanked by 2 guards. His presence was as commanding as ever, and Alice's heart fluttered, not in fear, but in surprise. Her father stepped out, wiping his hands on a cloth. "Your Highness," James said, bowing deeply. "What brings you here today?" Prince Charles dismounted gracefully. "I've come to see your vegetables and fruits," he replied. "I was passing through your village and thought it better to take them myself rather than have you make the trip to the castle." James quickly led the prince to their produce, where baskets of vibrant vegetables and ripe fruits were neatly arranged. The prince examined them thoughtfully, complimenting their freshness and quality. When it came time to discuss the price, Charles insisted on paying double, as the royal family always did. James thanked him profusely, his gratitude evident in his voice. Alice had been watching from the doorway, hesitant to approach. Gathering her courage, she stepped outside and curtsied, lowering her gaze. "Please," the prince said, his tone gentle. "Between friends, there's no need for formalities." Alice straightened, a shy smile playing on her lips. Charles returned the smile before excusing himself. The guards loaded the produce into a cart, and the prince mounted his horse once more. As he rode off, Alice couldn't help but watch until he disappeared down the path. That evening, as Alice prepared to sleep, an unusual noise drifted through the stillness. It came from the direction of the shelter where the goats and pigs were kept. At first, she thought she was imagining things, but the cries of the animals grew louder, more frantic. She called out to her mother, "Mama, do you hear that?" Camilla, busy with her sewing, barely glanced up. "Probably just the animals stirring," she said dismissively. But Alice couldn't shake her unease. Pulling a shawl around her shoulders, she slipped out of the house. The night was cool, and the moon cast pale light over the farm. She approached the shelter cautiously, her footsteps slow and deliberate. Inside, the goats and pigs were restless, their eyes wide and movements erratic. Alice scanned the area but saw nothing out of the ordinary. Just as she began to relax, a distant howl pierced the night, carried on the wind from the direction of the forest. Her breath caught. She backed away from the shelter, her unease growing with every step, and hurried back into the house. She didn't sleep well that night, her mind haunted by the sound. The next morning, James's voice carried across the farm as he searched the shelter. "Alice, come here," he called. She rushed to his side. "What is it?" "One of the goats is missing," he said, his brow furrowed. "I was planning to sell it soon, but now it's gone." Alice's chest tightened. "Last night the animals were acting strange. I even heard a howl coming from the forest." James scratched his head, his expression grim. "A thief, perhaps," he muttered. "These things happen sometimes, though not often here." Camilla joined them, shaking her head in disapproval. "We should have been more careful," she said. "This will cost us." Alice couldn't shake the feeling that something more sinister was at play. The memory of the howling echoed in her mind, and for the first time, the forest that surrounded their farm seemed less like a peaceful backdrop and more like a looming threat. As her father made plans to secure the remaining animals, Alice found herself glancing toward the distant tree line, the shadowy expanse of the forest holding secrets she wasn't sure she wanted to uncover. Alice couldn't shake her concern for her father. The missing goat had been a blow to his plans, and his stress was evident in the lines etched deeper into his face. That night, as she lay restless in her bed, the unsettling noises returned. The animals in the shelter were in a frenzy, their cries cutting through the quiet. Grabbing her shawl, Alice rushed to the shelter. Her steps quickened as she saw the goats and pigs pacing nervously. Suddenly, a shadowy figure darted through the edge of the woods. It was Logan. "Logan!" Alice called out, but he didn't stop. Instead, he moved with alarming speed, vanishing into the forest. Alice tried to follow, but Logan was far too fast. Frustrated and bewildered, she returned to the shelter, her mind racing with suspicions. The next morning, Alice told her father, "I think Logan is the one stealing goats." James paused, considering her words, but said little. Alice decided she couldn't rely on her father's quiet resolve. She needed to act. Taking some coins from her mother's bag, she headed to a small news publisher near the city. She handed over a neatly written note she had prepared and paid the man to print 50 copies of a small local newspaper. "Distribute these around the castle," she instructed a young boy, pressing a few more coins into his hand. "And make sure it's free for everyone. If you charge, I'll find someone else next time." The boy, eager to earn more, agreed and promptly carried out her request. By midday, the newspapers had made their way to the castle. In the castle, Queen Kinsley unfolded the paper and scanned its contents. It was full of local gossip, but one small article caught her attention. a story about a poor farmer's missing goat. Saddened by the news, the queen ordered her guards to investigate. The guards returned empty-handed, but they confirmed the goat had gone missing from the very farmer who supplied the castle with its vegetables and fruits. When Prince Charles heard about the article, he decided to visit the farmer himself. Arriving at Alice's home with 2 healthy goats, he stepped off his horse and greeted her warmly. "These are for you," Charles said. Alice hesitated. "Your Highness, I can't accept gifts from the royal family." Charles smiled gently. "I insist. Your family deserves this for all you do." Alice relented, thanking him. "Would you like some flowers?" she asked. "I'd love that," Charles replied. They walked through the farm as she picked fallen blossoms for him. As they talked, Charles asked about the missing goat, encouraging her to report if anything else seemed amiss. Before leaving, he declined Alice's offer of food, apologizing that his schedule demanded he return to the castle. When her father returned and saw the 2 new goats, he was overjoyed. "The prince himself brought these?" he asked, incredulous. "Yes," Alice said simply. James smiled proudly. "The royal family truly is generous." That night, Alice heard the noises again. This time, she grabbed a sharp piece of wood and crept toward the shelter. The animals were calm, but the cries she had heard earlier were now coming from the forest. Peering into the shadows, Alice caught sight of Logan once more. This time, his clothes were stained with blood, and his movements were frantic. His face was a mask of tension as he disappeared into the trees. The next morning, Alice overheard her father speaking to another farmer. "Another goat has gone missing," the man said. Alice clenched her fists. She was now certain Logan was behind the thefts. She began quietly investigating, asking subtle questions around the village. Her efforts revealed that Logan had recently started a small farm of his own, filled with goats. Alice couldn't ignore the mounting evidence. The Logan she had once thought of as a clever, charming man was now someone she could no longer trust. Determined to uncover the truth, she prepared herself to confront him. Alice was determined to put an end to Logan's wrongdoings. Once again, she visited the local news publisher, using more of the coins secretly taken from her mother's bag. With the same precision as before, she crafted a small article and asked the publisher to print 50 copies. Her instructions were clear, and soon the papers were distributed around the castle and nearby villages. This time, the headline read, "Another goat stolen. The thief remains at large. The queen, known for her love and care for her people, will surely bring justice soon." The queen, while initially reluctant, could not ignore the public outcry. The article had stirred the people's expectations, and her honor was now at stake. She summoned her guards and commanded them to patrol the farms at night. "Catch the thief," she ordered firmly. "This disgrace must end." By evening, a contingent of guards was stationed near various farms, armed and vigilant. Their presence was meant to reassure the villagers, but the tension in the air was undeniable. Alice was unaware of the guards' patrols as she prepared for bed. The animals in the shelter were unusually quiet that evening, a silence that made her uneasy. Her exhaustion from the day's work eventually led her to sleep. Later that night, the silence shattered with sudden screams and shouts. Alice jolted awake and rushed to her window. Outside, the flickering light of torches illuminated chaos. Guards were fleeing the fields, their faces pale with terror. What could make them run like this? Alice whispered to herself. She didn't feel safe enough to step outside and instead watched from her window. She noticed shadows darting between the trees, but the scene was too chaotic to make sense of. Eventually, the noise subsided, and she returned to bed, though sleep eluded her. By morning, whispers of horror spread through the village. The Queen herself arrived near the shelters where the guards had patrolled the previous night. Alice joined the growing crowd, her curiosity overriding her fear. When the Queen reached the scene, she was met with a horrifying sight. The guards who had been stationed there were all dead. Their lifeless bodies lay on the ground, their wounds deep and savage. The villagers stood in stunned silence as the Queen examined the scene. The cuts on the bodies were not clean but brutal, as though inflicted by a creature with immense strength and sharp claws. "This is no human act," someone whispered in the crowd. The Queen turned to her guards and issued orders, her voice steady despite the gruesome scene. "Find out what happened here. I want answers." Prince Charles arrived moments later, his face a mix of concern and determination. "Does anyone know what happened?" he asked. A man stepped forward hesitantly. "I saw something. A wolf," he said, his voice trembling. "It was massive, unlike any wolf I've ever seen. Its eyes glowed in the dark, and it vanished into the forest before I could get a good look." The crowd buzzed with fearful speculation. Prince Charles raised his voice to address them. "Whoever brings this wolf to me, alive and caged, will receive $2,000. The offer stirred excitement among the villagers, though the fear of the creature tempered their eagerness. Groups began forming, discussing strategies to capture the beast, while others quietly decided the risk wasn't worth it. The Queen added, "From now on, no one is to leave their homes after 10 p.m., except for those hunting the wolf. This is a matter of safety." As the villagers debated their plans, Alice's mind raced with a different motivation. She saw the $2,000 reward as a chance to improve her family's life. If she could capture the wolf, her father would never have to worry about money again. That evening, Alice worked tirelessly to prepare a trap. Using scraps of wood and rope, she crafted a crude but sturdy cage. She baited it with a piece of meat borrowed from the kitchen and set it up near the edge of the forest, where the wolf was last seen. She waited nearby, hidden among the trees, her heart thudding in her ears as the night deepened. Every rustle of leaves made her grip the sharpened stick in her hand tighter. But the hours dragged on, and nothing happened. The forest remained eerily quiet, save for the occasional hoot of an owl. As dawn broke, Alice approached the trap cautiously. It was untouched, the bait still sitting there. Disappointed but undeterred, she dismantled the trap and returned home. The voices of the villagers echoed in her mind. Could it really be an animal? Or was something far more sinister at play? For now, she was no closer to the truth, but she resolved to keep trying. The wolf, or whatever it was, had to be stopped. And if no one else could do it, she would. The morning sun was just beginning to rise when Alice heard the dreaded news. Another pig had gone missing from a nearby village. She quickly grabbed her coat and rushed toward the village, her thoughts racing. As she walked through the dirt path, she could sense the unease in the air. People huddled together in hushed conversations, their faces tight with fear. No one spoke openly about what had happened, but the signs were clear. Something terrible had been stealing from the farms again. Alice approached a group of villagers, but when she asked about the missing pig, their eyes darted nervously. None of them would meet her gaze for long, and a few even turned away. It didn't take long for Alice to notice that there was someone else in the crowd, someone who seemed out of place. Logan. He was standing apart from the others, walking strangely, as though something were wrong with him. His face was pale, his clothes ragged, and there was a limp in his step. Alice felt a rush of concern. She approached him cautiously, noticing that he was lying on the ground, unable to move. "Logan, what happened?" Alice asked, her voice trembling with worry. Logan winced as he looked up at her. His eyes were clouded with pain, and his breath came in shallow gasps. I was attacked," he said weakly. "By a wolf. I I tried to catch it, tried to trap it, but it was too strong. It attacked me before I could react. Alice froze. Her mind raced. This wasn't the thief she had suspected. Logan wasn't the one stealing goats and pigs. He had been hunting the real culprit, the wolf. The villagers gathered around Logan, murmuring in shock. They looked at Alice for guidance, but she was silent, her mind trying to process the sudden shift in everything she had believed. If Logan wasn't the thief, then who or what was responsible? Just then, a bone-chilling howl echoed through the air, cutting through the tense silence. It was distant but unmistakable. The sound of the wolf. The villagers' fear grew palpable, and they quickly scattered, heading back to the safety of their homes. Alice turned to head back, her instinct telling her that it wasn't safe to stay. Alice spent the following days trying to capture the wolf, convinced that it was the only way to stop the terror that had gripped the villages. She set up traps with scraps of food and spent hours in the forest, waiting for any sign of the creature. But nothing came. The wolf was too elusive, too clever. Each morning, Alice would return to find the traps empty and the forest still. Days passed in a blur of frustration and dread. Then, just when she thought things couldn't get worse, her father came to her with news that shattered what little hope remained. Their farm had been destroyed. The vegetables and fruits they had been nurturing were torn apart. What little had been left to sell was now ruined. Alice's father was devastated, but there was little they could do. They gathered the remnants of the crops and made their way to the castle to sell what was left. When they arrived, the queen's reaction was immediate. She inspected the half-rotten vegetables with disdain. "These are unacceptable," she said firmly, waving her hand. "I will not buy such poor-quality goods." Alice felt the sting of rejection but held her composure. She couldn't leave without at least asking for help. "Your Majesty," she said, her voice steady, "may I speak with Prince Charles?" The Queen looked at her with a raised eyebrow but nodded. "You may." When Prince Charles arrived, he greeted Alice and her father warmly. Alice's heart fluttered briefly at his kind smile, but the problem at hand was more pressing. She explained the situation, the destruction of their crops, the missing animals, and her fear that the wolf was still hunting. Charles listened intently, his expression darkening as she spoke. "I will investigate this personally," he promised. "And I will also give your father some money to help for the week. Please, let us not let this ruin you." Alice thanked him and accepted the money, though she knew it wouldn't be enough. Her family's survival depended on more than just a handout. It depended on catching the wolf. As Alice made her way back home, she knew something was wrong. More goats and pigs had gone missing. The wolf was still hunting. It was then that Alice realized the horrible truth. It wasn't just stealing. It was hunting the animals for food. The wolf wasn't just a nuisance. It was a threat to their survival. And there was no one else who could stop it. The villagers, though terrified, couldn't afford to wait any longer for help. Alice couldn't keep asking for the prince's intervention. This was her problem now, and she had no choice but to handle it herself. If she didn't stop the wolf, her family would starve. That night, she resolved to catch the beast on her own. She packed a small bag with supplies and set out for the woods, determined to find the wolf. She would use every ounce of her cunning, every trap she could think of, to capture it. There was no other choice. The forests were dark and silent, but Alice had no fear left. If the wolf was out there, she would find it, one way or another. The following day, Charles arrived at Alice's farm with a small group of guards. His presence alone seemed to lift the weight of the tension that had settled over the village. Alice watched him from a distance, her heart both heavy with worry and fluttering with something she had not quite understood. He had promised to solve the problem of the wolf, but as the days passed, the threat still loomed large over the village. Yet his determination to help was unwavering, and that was enough for her. For now. Charles had been visiting every day since, inspecting the farms, discussing plans with her father, and trying to reassure Alice that they would find a solution. Each time he came, their conversations grew a little warmer, a little more personal. Alice couldn't help but notice how his presence, his kindness, slowly chipped away at the walls she had built around her heart. One evening, after dinner with her family, Charles invited Alice to the royal castle. She agreed, though a small part of her felt uneasy. There was something about the grandeur of the castle, the opulence, that made her feel small and out of place. Yet, when Charles was around, all those insecurities seemed to vanish, replaced by something she couldn't quite name. The dinner was magnificent. The food was rich and flavorful, the conversation light and easy. Charles listened intently as Alice talked about her life on the farm, her dreams, and her fears. He shared stories of his own life, though they were often tinged with sadness, as he spoke of his royal duties and the pressures that came with being a prince. Alice had no idea how much she enjoyed being in his company until that night. After dinner, Charles offered to ride her back to her house on horseback. Alice hesitated at first, but something about the warmth in his smile made her agree. They mounted the horse together, and as they rode under the starlit sky, Alice couldn't help but feel the pull between them. The world seemed to fade around them, leaving just the two of them, Charles and Alice. As they were nearing Alice's home, the horse suddenly jerked to a halt. Alice wasn't prepared for the sudden stop and almost fell from the saddle. But before she could even react, Charles's arm shot out, gripping her tightly. His hands were firm and strong as he steadied her, pulling her back into the safety of the saddle. For a moment, their eyes locked, and Alice's breath caught in her throat. The world seemed to pause. Charles stared at her, his gaze intense yet gentle. She could feel his warmth, his presence, and in that instant, everything felt perfect. She leaned in slightly, drawn to him, but then, the reality of their differences hit her. He was a prince. She was a poor farmer's daughter. Before she could say a word, a strange sound broke the silence, a low growl from somewhere in the woods. Charles's eyes hardened, and his grip on the reins tightened. Without a word, he urged the horse forward, his focus entirely on the path ahead. Suddenly, from the thick shadows of the forest, a deer burst into the clearing. It looked terrified, its eyes wide with panic. Before Charles could react, the unmistakable howl of the wolf echoed in the distance, sending the deer bolting forward in a desperate attempt to escape. "Go!" Alice cried, gripping Charles tighter as the horse galloped faster, its hooves pounding against the ground. The sound of the wolf's howl grew louder, but Charles pushed the horse forward with urgency, his face set in determination. They raced back toward the castle, the wolf's howl now a constant, haunting presence behind them. Alice clung to Charles, her pulse quickening with the fear of what they had narrowly escaped. As they reached the gates of the castle, Charles pulled the horse to a stop. He dismounted first, then helped Alice down. "Thank God you're all right," he said, his voice full of relief. Alice didn't know what to say. In that moment, she realized just how much she had come to care for him. He was not just a prince, but someone who cared about her well-being, someone who had risked his life to make sure she was safe. Charles's hands gently grasped hers, and in a soft voice, he added, "I've brought something for you." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small packet. "These are special seeds. They will help your farm recover quickly. I know it's not much, but I hope it will help." Alice looked at the packet in surprise. "Thank you," she whispered, touched by his gesture. As they stood in the moonlight, Charles seemed to hesitate for a moment before stepping closer. "I'll make sure the wolf is dealt with," he said, his tone resolute. You don't have to worry about it anymore." Alice felt a warmth spread through her chest, a mixture of relief and gratitude. Before she could respond, Charles led her to her house. When they arrived, he turned to her with a soft smile, his eyes filled with something she couldn't quite place. "Goodbye, Alice," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. He leaned in and kissed her lightly on the cheek. Alice stood frozen for a moment, her heart racing. She could still feel the warmth of his lips on her skin, a tender moment that made her feel something she had never expected. As Charles rode away, Alice watched him disappear into the night, her mind swirling with emotions she didn't fully understand. For the first time in a long while, she felt a glimmer of hope. Perhaps things weren't as hopeless as they seemed. She looked at the seeds in her hand, knowing that with Charles's help, she might just have a future worth fighting for. Alice carefully planted the seeds Charles had given her, hoping they would restore her family's farm. The earth was still cold under her fingers, but she nurtured the tiny sprouts with the care they deserved, knowing that the future of her farm, her family's livelihood, rested on these fragile seeds. That night, as the moon climbed high in the sky, a familiar, haunting sound echoed through the air, a wolf's howl. Alice froze, her heart racing with a mixture of fear and uncertainty. It was near midnight, the darkest time of the night, and the howl was closer than it had been in weeks. Her instincts told her she couldn't ignore it, but she also knew she had to be careful. The wolf had been a shadow over the village for too long. Grabbing a thick shawl to shield her from the night's chill, Alice ventured outside. She kept a safe distance from the farms, staying hidden in the shadows, hoping to see what was causing the commotion. As she approached the edge of the woods, she noticed a figure standing alone in the moonlight. It was Charles. "Charles!" she called, rushing toward him. "What are you doing here? It's so late! It's not safe!" Charles turned to face her, his expression grim. He was holding a shotgun, his eyes scanning the darkness. "Alice, I'm hunting the wolf. It's been terrorizing the farms, destroying livelihoods. It's time we put an end to it." Alice's stomach dropped. "You can't. Please, Charles, you're not prepared for this. You'll be in danger." "I have to do this," he said, his voice firm. "The wolf has taken too much. I'm ending it tonight." Before Alice could protest further, the air seemed to shift. A growl, low and menacing, rumbled from the depths of the forest. Alice's eyes widened as the massive shape of the wolf emerged from the shadows. It was even larger than she had imagined, its glowing eyes locked on them. It looked hungry, vicious, its fur matted with the dirt and grime of the forest. The wolf lunged, its claws outstretched. Charles fired the shotgun, the blast ringing out through the silent night. The wolf howled in pain and collapsed to the ground. But to Alice's horror, it wasn't finished. The creature pushed itself back onto its feet, blood dripping from its side, and with a powerful, desperate bound, it sprinted back into the forest. Charles cursed under his breath, lowering the shotgun. "We can't let it get away. We need to end this once and for all." "Alice, don't go after it," he urged, his face full of resolve. "It's not safe." But Alice shook her head, her mind racing. "No, Charles, we need to stop. This isn't something you can fight alone. It's dangerous. We should return. We've done enough tonight." Charles hesitated, clearly torn between his duty to protect the people and his desire to end the terror once and for all. He looked at Alice, his gaze softening. "I'll keep trying. I won't give up. But you're right. It's not worth risking your life over." The next day, Alice went about her morning routine, but her thoughts were far from the work at hand. She'd barely gotten started when she heard the commotion coming from the village. People were whispering and pointing as Logan was being carried to the hospital. His leg was badly injured, and there were strange murmurs in the crowd. "Logan's been attacked," someone said. "By the werewolf, they say. It happened last night." Alice's stomach churned. Logan? Her mind raced as she remembered the events of the previous night, the wolf, the shot Charles had fired. Logan had been hurt in exactly the same spot, the leg where Charles had shot the wolf. Could it be? Could Logan be the very wolf they had been hunting? Determined to find out the truth, Alice rushed to the castle, hoping to speak with Charles. When she arrived, she explained her suspicions, her voice urgent. "Charles, I think Logan is the werewolf. He was injured last night, right where you shot the wolf." Charles's face darkened, his jaw tightening. "Don't worry, Alice. We'll catch him. I'll make sure of it." Alice's heart raced as she followed him to the hospital where Logan was being treated. The doctors were tending to his wounds, but he was conscious, lying on a cot in one of the rooms. Alice approached cautiously, her eyes narrowing as she studied him. Logan looked different now, his face pale with pain. But there was something else, something in the way he refused to meet her gaze. "I know what you are, Logan," Alice said, her voice steady but cold. "I know you're the werewolf." Logan's eyes snapped to hers, his expression hardening. "I'm not the one you think I am." "You can lie to everyone else," Alice replied, crossing her arms. "But I'm not a fool. You're the one who's been terrorizing this village, hunting the goats, the pigs, the animals. It was you all along." Logan shifted uncomfortably, his eyes flicking nervously toward the door. "I didn't do it for fun. I was taking my revenge. The wolf, he took my goats, my pigs. It wasn't just me. He's a predator. He comes at night, and he hunts whatever he can." Alice wasn't convinced. "You think that justifies what you did? You've been stealing animals from the villages. You're a danger, Logan." Logan's face twisted with frustration. "You don't understand. I couldn't stop it. I had to do something." "No," Alice said firmly. "If you don't stop, I'll tell everyone. They'll know the truth about you." Logan's face fell, his shoulders slumping in defeat. He knew he had no choice. "Fine," he muttered. "I'll stop." Alice felt a weight lift off her shoulders. She had finally uncovered the truth, and though it hadn't been easy, she knew that Logan would not be hunting any more animals from the villages. The terror would finally come to an end. She turned and left the hospital, the cool breeze of the night offering some comfort. The village, the farms, and her father would be safe now. Alice had done it. The moon hung low in the night sky, casting a pale glow across Alice's farm as she walked through the quiet, empty fields. The wind rustled the leaves of the trees, a soft whisper that only heightened the eerie silence of the night. It had been a week since she confronted Logan, and her farm was still recovering from the damage caused by the mysterious wolf. But tonight, something was wrong. Alice had gone to check on her remaining goats, only to find that once again, one was missing. Panic surged through her, a familiar fear creeping up her spine. She had hoped the problem was over, that Logan had stopped his rampage, but now it seemed as though the wolf was still at large. Her feet carried her quickly toward the castle, her mind racing with questions. She needed to find Charles. She had to know if he was still hunting the wolf or if something had gone wrong. She reached the gates of the royal castle and asked around for the prince, but no one seemed to know where he was. Panic intensified in her chest. Where could he be? She searched the hallways, the courtyards, and the royal gardens, but there was no sign of him. With a heavy heart, Alice turned and made her way to the hospital to check on Logan. The doctors assured her that Logan had been resting, and he had not left since the day of his injury. She felt a strange mix of relief and confusion. If Logan had not left the hospital, then who was behind the attacks on her farm? Her mind raced with possibilities. If Logan hadn't done it, then that could only mean one thing. The real werewolf was still out there. "Logan," she said, her voice filled with urgency as she approached his bed. "Tell me the truth. Who is the one hunting my goats and pigs?" Logan looked at her, his eyes filled with regret. "I can't tell you, Alice. You won't believe me, but I can show you." Alice felt a strange unease wash over her as Logan slowly sat up. Despite his injuries, there was determination in his eyes. He motioned for her to follow him. "Come with me. I'll show you." Without a word, Alice followed Logan as he led her out of the hospital and toward the forest. The shadows of the trees stretched long in the dim moonlight as they made their way through the dense underbrush. Finally, they reached a clearing. There, scattered on the ground, were clothes, royal garments, the kind only the prince would wear. "What does this mean?" Alice asked, confusion and disbelief written on her face. "Has the prince been attacked?" "No," Logan answered, his voice grave. "He can't be attacked. He's the one who's been doing the attacking." Alice's breath caught in her throat. "What? No. You're lying." But Logan's expression was too serious. "I'm not lying, Alice. I know what I saw." Alice could hardly process what Logan was saying. She stood there in shock, trying to make sense of the pieces of the puzzle that were beginning to form. She scolded Logan for making such false claims, but deep down, something was stirring inside her, doubt, confusion, and fear. Before she could say anything else, she turned to leave, wanting to distance herself from Logan's wild accusations. But then, just as she reached the edge of the clearing, she saw something that froze her in her tracks. A wolf, massive and strong, was stalking one of her father's remaining goats. Her heart raced as she ducked behind a tree, watching the scene unfold. The wolf lunged at the goat, its jaws closing around the animal. Alice held her breath, hiding in the shadows, hoping the wolf wouldn't notice her. The beast finished its hunt quickly, and then, just as the moonlight illuminated the clearing, something incredible happened. The wolf began to transform. Alice's heart stopped as she watched, unable to tear her eyes away from the scene. The wolf's form shrank, and soon, standing in its place, was none other than Prince Charles himself, his eyes gleaming with an unnatural hunger. Alice stumbled backward, her legs weak, as the weight of what she had just witnessed crashed over her. The prince was the werewolf, the one who had been hunting her goats, her pigs, all along. She didn't stop running until she reached home, her breath ragged and her mind reeling with disbelief. How could this be true? The prince, the charming, handsome, noble prince, was a werewolf, a creature of the night, a dangerous monster. The next day, Alice didn't waste any time. She made her way straight to the castle, determined to confront Charles. When she found him, he was alone, standing near the royal gardens. She could see the weight of guilt in his eyes before he spoke. "I'm sorry, Alice," Charles said quietly. "I never wanted you to find out like this, but I can't hide it anymore. I am the werewolf, and I don't want to hurt you. I love you." Alice stood there, her mind a storm of confusion and anger. "Why don't you stop?" she asked, her voice shaking. "Why don't you control yourself?" "I can't," he whispered, his voice filled with regret. "It's a curse, Alice. I can't control it. The wolf takes over, and there's nothing I can do." Her heart ached as she looked at him, torn between the man she thought she knew and the monster he had become. "Then we should separate," she said softly, her eyes filled with sorrow. "If you can't control it, I can't be with you. You'll hurt someone else. I can't risk that." Charles looked angry, his eyes flashing with fury. "You don't understand," he said, his voice rising. "You can't just walk away from me." Alice stepped back, shaking her head. "If you hunt my goats again, I will tell everyone. You'll be exposed. No more lies." With a final, angry look, Charles walked away, leaving Alice standing alone in the garden, her heart heavy with the decision she had just made. That night, Alice lay in bed, unable to sleep. Her mind raced with questions and fears. Then, just as she was about to drift off, she heard a soft voice calling her name from outside. Opening her window, she saw Logan standing beneath the moonlight, his face serious. "Alice," he said, "the prince is coming. He's coming to hunt again." Before Alice could respond, Logan apologized, his voice filled with sincerity. "I'm sorry for how I acted before. I've changed. I'm not the same person anymore." Alice looked at him, unsure of what to say. But when Logan transformed into a werewolf before her eyes, she knew that he was willing to help. She nodded, feeling a strange mix of relief and unease. The battle that followed was fierce. Logan and Charles clashed in the clearing near her home, the two werewolves fighting with brutal force. Logan fought bravely, but he was no match for Charles's power and speed. In a last-ditch effort, Logan climbed a tall tree, baiting Charles to follow him. The prince, eager to finish the fight, leaped after Logan, only to land on a bed of sharp iron spikes hidden beneath the leaves. Both werewolves were badly injured, but Logan, although wounded, was the first to rise. He managed to escape, dragging himself back to Alice's home, where she quickly tended to his wounds. The villagers, alerted by the noise of the struggle, gathered around. As the full moon began to rise once more, they watched in horror as the prince transformed back into his human form. Shocked gasps echoed through the crowd as they realized the truth. The prince was the werewolf who had been terrorizing their village. The villagers quickly imprisoned Charles, and he was taken away, his fate sealed. Alice, though saddened by the loss of the man she had once admired, felt a sense of relief. The terror was over. Logan, now in human form, was treated for his wounds, and after some time, he began to recover. As he sat up, he looked at Alice with a sheepish grin. "I'm sorry, Alice," he said. "I'm embarrassed. I really do want to change." Alice smiled softly. "You already have, Logan." As she helped him to his feet, she couldn't help but laugh. "You know, when we were alone, I kept a knife on me just in case. If you ever tried anything again, I was ready." Logan raised an eyebrow, clearly surprised. "Really?" he asked, his voice light. "I don't know whether to be insulted or relieved." Alice smiled. "You need rest," she said gently. Logan grinned. "How about we go out for lunch? Don't worry, I won't try anything." Alice laughed. "Well, not today," she replied. "But not never." She turned and walked away, leaving Logan behind. Her goats and pigs were safe, and though she still had doubts, Alice knew that Logan had become a true friend. And for the first time in a long while, she felt hope for the future. Maybe one day Alice will love Logan.